And Einstein, I don't know much about his faith. I don't know much about his background. He said, the answer I'll give you is this: prayer. Prayer is probably one of the most missed things that this world has ever seen, and one of the things that we still need to mine and understand. And I wonder if the Church of Jesus Christ, if that's true for us. Like as Christians, as people that follow Jesus, like do we see and understand prayer for all that it is, the power that it has, the calling that we've been given towards that end, to be people of prayer? Do we understand it? Do we depend on it? And I guess that's one of my questions to start our sermon this morning, is what do you depend on? What in your life do you depend on? In an age and a culture of independence and individuality, we don't like thinking that we're dependent on anything. But that is quickly and easily debunked. Water, H2O, right? Like that's simplistic, but you are all dependent on water. I'm dependent on water. You could maybe go a few days without it, but eventually, very quickly, you're going to die without it. And then food. I mean, you can go longer than a few days, but eventually your body is going to tell you, I need food or I'm giving up. So you're dependent on food. You depend on oxygen, right? Just to be able to breathe, to be able to speak, to be able to live. And these are some of the most simplistic of ideas that demonstrate that we are people of dependence. That we're people that depend on things, but let's maybe go to some other things. You having a job. Maybe it's not the job that you have because you say, hey, I don't need my company, I can go. Well, you're dependent on a job, unless you're a trust fund baby eating out of a golden spoon. Chances are that the majority of us in here are dependent on doing some task, performing some task, and then getting compensated for it, right? What is it that you depend on? What is it? Have you ever really thought about the various areas of your life that speak to dependence? And I don't know of a clearer way that we demonstrate our need of God than through the avenue of prayer. Like, is there something more than that? Is there something more than prayer? I can't think of anything that speaks to or shows how much we value God than when we're depending on him through this avenue of prayer. And so prayer communicates a lot of things. It communicates that we understand our limitations. How many times where you've been in a place where you say, hey, I've got nowhere else to turn, so I'm going to turn to God because I know that I've exhausted everything that I could do here. And so prayer will communicate your limitations. It will also communicate how you understand that God is able. It will communicate that you believe, that you understand that God is able, that I'm coming to you believing, trusting that you can do something that I can't do. I read the story this week. It was a kind of a joke, but it was of a man who had his own little airplane. And he calls into the tower and he says, pilot to tower, 300 miles away from the land, and I'm 600 feet in the air, and I'm running out of gas, and I'm descending rapidly. Can you advise? Over. The tower to pilot. The dispatcher began, repeat after me. Our Father, who art in heaven. Right? Like in that very moment, there's nothing that you're going to be able to do other than a miracle of God. And it's kind of that idea that there's no atheist in a foxhole. Right? Like when life gets hard and it gets difficult and intense fear begins, that there's something inside of us that knows, that calls on something that's greater than us. There's moments of intense crisis that will lead us to depend on something or someone. And my question to you, what is that? What is that something or someone that you've put all your chips in and say, I'm depending on this for my life? And there's things that are necessary that you need to depend on. But my question is, do we depend on God? And I believe that our prayer life would show that. You know, when you think of the concept of prayer, like when you really just think about the bare bones of what prayer is, it's communicating with God. Communicating with God. You know, there's a lot of people in this world that I would love to communicate with. You know, I mean, over the years at Twitter, you know, you throw some shout outs at some people and hoping that they're just going to even bite. And how many of you, maybe you've had an influencer respond to you? I mean, that's an exciting feeling. I don't know what it's like, but I'm imagining it's exciting. And to be able to, I remember I got to meet one of my heroes of the faith. I got to meet him as a pastor in Dallas. And I got to meet him, and I got to walk around with him and talk with him for just a brief moment. And I remember just the exhilarating, like I'm like trembling walking with you because I'm thinking, how in the world do I get to talk to you? What if we really understood God? What if we really understood prayer? Like, what reference would we come into? What expectations would we come with? Or what excitement would we have to be able to speak to the God who spoke the Milky Way into existence? I mean, I think we would be rushing for those opportunities. But I don't think we frame prayer for all that it is. That we get to commune and communicate with God. You see, in the history of even the Bible, the aspect of prayer was a revolutionary idea when Jesus taught the disciples, and he said, okay, I'm going to teach you how to pray. He says, our Father, that you get to communicate with the Father, was a revolutionary idea. You see, in the Old Testament, in the temple, there was a system that God had in place, and there was a room within the temple called the Holy of Holies. And there was a curtain that surrounded it, and the Holy of Holies was a place where God dwelt. And so there was all these ceremonial laws and rituals for a priest once a year to enter into that place, enter into the presence of God, and make a sacrifice. But then you fast forward in the New Testament, and while Jesus is on the cross and he's hanging there on the cross, that the scriptures would say that the curtain that surrounded in the temple and the Holy of Holies, that it tore in two. And so there was no longer a barrier. There was no longer a sacrifice needed. Jesus was once for all the sacrifice that allows us to commune and communicate with God. It's a really beautiful reality that we get to approach the throne of grace with confidence, the author of Hebrews would say. That you could approach the throne of grace with confidence, not with timidity, that you know your sacrifice was good and that Jesus puts you in right standing with the Father. And so now the New Testament would say that we are a nation of priests for those who are believers. Which means we don't need some individual man to come and tell us that we can, to mediate for us to God, that we can go to God. Like right now in this very moment, you could speak to him. Like you could speak to him, and it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. Like God answers prayer. And I wonder, do we? Do we relish in this opportunity? Can we fathom this opportunity? And I think before us, and I know that before us, there are needs. There are real needs that are beyond you. There are real needs that are beyond me. There's real needs beyond us, even collectively and communally, and we put all of our efforts and all of our resources together. There are needs beyond what we can do. And are we going to be a people of faith that demonstrate that faith in prayer? It was F.B. Meyer, the author of the great little book, The Secret of Guidance. He said this: the great tragedy of life is not unanswered prayer, but unoffered prayer. The great tragedy of life is not unanswered prayer, but unoffered prayer. You know, like instead of it being something that we do every day, like eating and drinking and breathing and walking and living, I think oftentimes we treat prayer like it's like one of those things that you see in the hallway where it's a glass and it says break in case of emergency. That we come to God, we come to him in prayer as some sort of last resort, some final ditch effort. Okay, I've tried everything else. Okay, God, I'm going to, fine, I'll throw a Hail Mary up to you. And maybe you'll answer. And please hear me, I don't think that prayer as a last resort is wrong. But do we see him as a first resort? Like when crisis comes in, and I think oftentimes we consciously or unconsciously treat prayer and we tie it to crisis. That prayers exist because crises do. Do we see it as much more that we're just depending on God for necessary things that aren't even just like some critical moment? I want to tell you some things biblically that prayer does. I want to tell you some things biblically that we can see that prayer does. In Luke chapter 3, verse 1, it's at Jesus' baptism. While he was praying, it says that the heavens were opened. Prayer opens heaven. How cool is that? In Luke chapter 6, verse 12, as Jesus was getting ready to call his disciples, it says that he spent the whole night in prayer. Prayer gives direction, it gives calling. In Luke chapter 9, verse 29, at his transfiguration, Jesus was praying, and it says that the appearance of his face changed, and it says that his clothing became white and gleaming. Prayer enables us to see the glory of God. Prayer enables us to see the glory of God, to behold him. In John 17, in Jesus' high priestly prayer impacted the lives of others. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 39, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus pours out his heart to God. Prayer allows us to pour out our hearts to God and to actually know that he hears and that he cares. In Luke 23, verse 24, as he hung on the cross, Jesus prays to his Father as those that are mocking him. He prays. He says, hey, Father, would you forgive them, for they know what they do. There was unity between the Father and the Son in the most critical of moments. It united the Father and the Son in that moment. Prayer allows us to maintain unity with God in the most difficult of circumstances. And I don't know about you, but when you think about the power of prayer in all these various areas of our lives, it's like, why don't I depend on this more? What keeps me from this? What makes it so difficult? Like prayer for Jesus wasn't just crisis, but it was habit. Right? It was habit and crisis, right? Jesus on the cross, he's praying. In the moment of the garden, it says that he's sweating blood, literally sweating blood. I mean, the most devastating moment. He knows he's going to go face torment, and he's praying, and he's sweating blood. And so, yes, it's not wrong to pray in crisis, but do we see Jesus as a first resort? And I truly believe as we've gone throughout this book of Colossians, these 3 chapters before this, as Paul is writing down and he's teaching that Jesus is supreme and that he's sufficient and that he's all that you need. He's combating a culture that's saying, no, put your hope in this, put your security in this. And there's all these false senses of security that the world will tempt us to believe. And Paul continues, no, Jesus is enough. He's sufficient. He's supreme. He's all that you need. He keeps pointing them back to where their hope ought to be. And the struggle for us is that we have to live in these 2 worlds. The struggle for us is that we have to live in these 2 worlds, like a world that is constantly tempting us, constantly calling us to experience what they're offering, and then yet the words of the scriptures would say, no, set your minds on the things that are above, where Christ is seated. Fix your eyes on the things that are above. Fix them on another world. And so we live in this limbo of these 2 worlds. And what Paul has done is he systematically called you to where to put your hope, where to put your faith. And it would make sense that at the very end he says, pray. Pray. Because prayer, again, communicates that we are where we're finding our sufficiency, where we're finding our hope, where we're placing our dependence. It's like, are you really going to trust that Jesus is all? And if so, you will go to him. You will communicate with him. There's nothing that measures our dependence on God more than our prayer life. More than how many Christian podcasts we're subscribed to. More than how many Bible verse mugs and t-shirts we have. More than all of that, what measures our dependence on God is our prayer life. It's prayer. And one of the greatest barriers to prayer is going to be that we are going to try and find sufficiency, supremacy in the things here below. In the things here below. I mean, that's the whole book of Ecclesiastes, that humanity is bent towards trying to find pleasure and satisfaction and fulfillment in the world on the things that are below. And then he continually, even the author of Ecclesiastes would tell you, get above the sun, get what's beyond this world. And it's in those moments of life where we find the world to be dark, broken, and cold, where we will turn to God. We will say, hey, we've exhausted everything else, so now I'm coming to you. And the best that I can understand the scriptures, I believe that you're going to be met with, you'll be welcomed. That you'll be welcomed even when you've exhausted the world and you've exhausted the efforts and you've exhausted the pleasures here in the world. You won't be turned away. I mean, how beautiful is that? The psalmist wrote this in Psalm 51 after he was pursuing his own flesh, his own passions, his own desires, and he was left emptied and destroyed. He writes Psalm 51 right after his incident with Bathsheba, where he has this woman's husband killed and he makes his way with her, and at that very moment when he's feeling broken and empty, he writes this in Psalm 51:17, a broken and contrite heart you will not despise. A broken and contrite heart you will not despise. Like maybe you've gone out and you've tried the world. You've tried the things here below. You've tried the things under the sun. And you learned that it wasn't all satisfying. And you turn to God in that moment. Guess what? If all you have to offer him is a broken and contrite heart, he'll take it. He'll take it. If you come to him and you like the prodigal and say, hey, I went out and I soiled my wild oats and I did my own thing and I tried and I tried and I tried and it failed me. Will you take me? He will. The love of the Father is that beautiful. It's that powerful. He takes people in the last moment of desperation. He answers Hail Mary prayers. He has saved people on their deathbed. Literally the finalist of seconds of people to just display a heartfelt gratitude, a heartfelt call to the Lord that he answers. Because I think about that moment of that thief on that cross. And he's hanging there on the cross and he looks over at Jesus. And he says, hey, Jesus, would you remember me? Would you remember me when you go into your kingdom and you reign? Would you remember me? Jesus, today, you're going to be with me in paradise. I mean, that's all he had in the last moments. I mean, I'm guessing he's struggling to even get those words out. Would you remember me? Jesus does. He answers that prayer of desperation. He meets people in places of desperation. So if you're here today and you say, hey, I'm in that place of desperation, you're welcome to come to the table. You're welcome to come to the Father. He's ready to meet you. He's ready to give you hope. He's ready to give you a future. He's ready to give you all. He's ready to meet you in a place of desperation. But for those of us that are Christians, for those of us that already have unity with God, why would we treat him like a last resort? Why not first and last? Why not everything? Here's how Paul begins landing the plane here in Colossians. Colossians 4:1, devote yourselves to prayer with an alert mind and a thankful heart. Paul begins, he says, devote yourselves to prayer, or continue earnestly in prayer, depending on your translation. The original language, it says, continue steadfastly in prayer. The word translated continue steadfastly, and then the Greek is actually just one word, and it means to persist in, adhere firmly to, or remain devoted to, or to give unremitting care to. It's an idea that's communicating dedication. Dedication to prayer. It's a very powerful word in the Greek. It's only used 10 times in the New Testament, and 4 of those times is always associated to prayer. So it would seem to me, based on the New Testament writings, is that God thinks it's really important, really powerful to continue on in prayer. He's not viewing prayer as an option, it's an order. 2 of the most instructive parables Jesus ever told on prayer was talking about a persistence in prayer that we ought to have. Luke 18:1, as Jesus was telling them a parable, he was telling them to show them that they ought to pray always and to not lose heart. Luke 18:1, to pray always and to not lose heart. Luke 11:9, this is where we see the promise that says, ask and it shall be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. All 3 of those verbs are present tense, and so it could also be translated, keep on knocking, keep on asking, keep on seeking. Like, don't give up. Don't give up on prayer. Just because you prayed a few times and maybe you didn't hear anything, or maybe you didn't think it was doing anything, like the scriptures will call you to continue in this. Be persistent in this. And that can be hard. Because oftentimes the pain of waiting is debilitating, where you're waiting on God to do something, to work, to move, to answer, and you're wondering, okay, am I saying it the wrong way? Am I not saying it with the right tone? Am I not using the right adjectives? Am I not expressing how big of a deal this is? Like, have I just gotten the words wrong? Is my faith just not right? Like, what do I have to do to unlock the code to get some answers here? Maybe some of you have been in that place of waiting, and you're wondering, and you're waiting, and you're just confused. The scriptures say that that even before you ask, God knows what it is you need. That even before you were to ask God, hey, I'm needing you to do something, God already knows. And so the question then is, why pray at all? Right? Like, if God already knows, then why even pray? Because here's what prayer is not you convincing God of what you need and hopeful that he's going to give it to you. That's not what it is. Prayer is a convincing yourself of your need of God to move into work. He already knows what you need. But do you know that you need God to work and to move on your behalf? Persistence means not giving up. Not giving up. And I know that there are many of you in here that have things you're praying for, and you've continued on, and you continued on, and you're waiting, and you're hoping, and you're just wondering. Like, I'm joining with you in that confusion and that wonder of why does God have timetables? Why does God operate when he operates, and why doesn't he just do it when we're asking? Because I know that there are some of you in here, many of you that Karen and I actually pray for every single morning. And we're waiting on God to answer. We're waiting on God to give you what's good. Because do you know that when Jesus is teaching this crowd of people on asking and seeking and knocking, that he concludes with ask, seeking, and knocking until God answers, or until God gives you what is good. Where he says, hey, if you who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more then could I? I mean, talk about a backhanded compliment. He does say that you know how to give good gifts to your children. He just tells you that you're evil. He's like, if you then who are evil know how to give good gifts to your children, don't you think I can? Don't you think I will? So if God has an answer, brother, sister, keep asking. Keep knocking. Keep approaching his throne of grace. And if what you have is not good, then keep asking. Keep knocking, keep seeking. But ultimately, you're going to be required to trust that God's answer is good, not what you're hoping for. George Mueller, known as one of the greatest prayer warriors of all time, had this to say about persistence in prayer. He said, "It is a common temptation of Satan to make us give up on the reading of word and prayer when our enjoyment is gone, as if it were of no use to read the scriptures when we do not enjoy them, as if it were no use to pray when we have no spirit of prayer. The truth is that in order to enjoy the word, we ought to continue to read it. And the way to obtain a spirit of prayer is to continue to pray. The less we read the word of God, the less we desire to read it. And the less we pray, the less we desire to pray." It was George Mueller. Be persistent in prayer. And I'd imagine that some of the requests that you've continued on in, that you've continued to ask God, I'm sure those are beginning to get difficult to even utter those words. But brother, sister, keep on praying. And we're not looking again to convince God of what we need. We're looking to show ourselves as those that are dependent on him. And Paul says to ask with an alert mind and a thankful heart. I think about that word alert there in verse 2. I think about that word alert. It's a word describing a posture of our prayer life. That we would be alert. The original word would better be translated to be wakeful. That we would be awake when we're coming to the Lord. That we would be alert. That we would come with a clear mind before the Lord with our need. Because I would imagine if there are those prayers that you continue to pray and you continue to pray and continue to pray, that there might be a level of almost a thought of, I could utter the same prayer in my sleep. You almost come with that empty expectation. You almost come in with a closed mind, and Paul said, no, don't do that. Be alert and be thankful. Not because more eloquent or cheerier prayers are what unlocks God's answers. They're not some secret code, not at all. Paul says, but to come believing and then be thankful. N.T. Wright commentates and says this: the connection here with thanksgiving may suggest the threefold rhythm: intercession, watching for answers to prayer, and thanksgiving when answers appear. I think another thing that makes prayer so difficult for us is when God's answers don't align with our hopes and dreams. When God's answers to your prayers don't align with your hopes and dreams, and then having to trust that what his answer is then good. It's like, okay, you're not giving me what I want, but is he giving you what you need? Is he giving you what you need? And so there will be this shift that we need to see in our hearts. That God, I want what you want. I want what you have for me. Even if your answer undermines my hope and dreams. When God's answer to your work situation is termination, are you okay with that answer? When God's answer to your financial crisis is the loss of something, will you be able to trust him in that? And trust that his answer is good. When God answers differently, that's just hard. When God answers differently, that's just hard. And will we be able to posture our hearts in such a way that we have gratitude with what he gives? It'll require us to develop a hunger and thirst for the Lord, for his word. That the more that we would become like him, the more we'd find that our desires are shaped according to him. That the more that we pray to him, the more we communicate with him, the more we engage with him in his word, and we see ourselves becoming more transformed to his image, will we then see that our prayers align with his answers in such a way that we're grateful for whatever he gives, however he answers, that we would be able to say, despite what I want, what you give, I will find to be enough. That I will find to be enough. I've heard it said this way: if you knew everything God knows, you would ask for the things that he gives you. If you knew everything God knew, you would ask for the things that he gives you. I want to know what God knows. I want to know, I want to see what he's doing in the world. I want to see what he's accomplishing in through my life. But if we never commune with him, if we never communicate with him, how are we going to know? If we never set our minds on the things that are above where Christ is seated, how will we ever find ourselves in the alignment of his will? And if we never find ourselves in the alignment of his will, how will we know that he is all sufficient? There is going to be a requirement of us to align ourselves with God and setting our minds on the things that are above. I can't think of a better way than if we would be people of prayer. That prayer would become a rhythm and a habit of our life, that it would be a way of being for us as a people that say Christ is sufficient. I don't know what it is in your life right now. I don't know if it's marital conflict or financial stress or problems at work or career or whatever it is. And all the temptations, all the solutions are going to be, hey, look here, look there, look left, look right, look, listen to this podcast, listen to this person. And it's like, man, do we see that Jesus and his word is all sufficient for all of life? And when we struggle and we want to run, will we devote ourselves to prayer? Will we continue in it and trust that he is enough? This is Things Above. Let me pray for us.